This video will contain spoilers for the entire numbered Xenoblade Chronicles trilogy. Remember how I changed the Halloween video to the zombie joke at the last minute because the original video was about the husks? Well, this is part 1 of actually making what that video was originally supposed to be. That video is actually completely finished and uploaded unlisted on the channel right now, and I may share that link at some point or even make it public. In fact, if you really want to see it, you can sub to my Patreon and go back to the old post, because it got to the point of me sending it out to patrons and being a day away from going public before I decided to not actually publish it, and that was for a couple reasons. Firstly, I was trying to make a goofy, lighthearted Halloween video, and in the process, it just morphed into another exploration of a very messed up thing Moebius did, so tonally it didn't fit. And then also, only about half of the video is actually about the husks themselves. That video was 18 minutes long. The last 5 minutes of that were me just riffing on the zombie joke that turned into an entire video in and of itself. And along the way to talking about the husks, I also brought up something that seems to be very, very important to the story, but is mentioned exactly once in any cutscene. And that is the quote-unquote conditioning that Y implies all of the soldiers in Keves and Agnes receive. So instead of just remaking a video that's only half about husks and expanding on the conditioning stuff there too, I'm just going to make 2 separate shorter videos, one about the conditioning, and then the next video I make is just going to be a redo of the husk concept, because I don't really know how to title and thumbnail something that's just kind of about 2 things, even if they are fairly connected. So this time we're going to talk about the conditioning, and next time you'll get the redone version of the husk stuff, which hopefully is better articulated and a bit more expanded upon. So you're just getting more content out of this. The original Halloween special morphed into, I think, a better Halloween special for what I was trying to go for, and then just 2 regular but slightly shorter Luxon videos. So I don't think there's a lot to complain about here, unless you're me, who now has to do effectively 3 times the work. Anyway, I kind of lied. The concept of conditioning is technically brought up twice, not once. Both times are inside story Mio, and both brought up by Y, referencing the same characters, and only split up by a fight, but it's technically mentioned twice. If you control F the script, you will see the word conditioning 2 times. So how does that give me enough to make an entire video? Because you can see the ripples of that throughout everything else about Keves and Agnes in the entire game. The exact scene is when all the dead people from the characters' pasts who Y resurrected or brainwashed show up at Colony Omega to fight the party. And Senna tries to reach out to Miyabi, and then Y responds, "Save thy breath. The revenants neither remember nor feel. Only the instincts to fight tooth and nail for survival. Normally they would undergo basic conditioning in a cradle prior to being awoken, as you all once did. They would fight for 10 years before returning to Her Majesty." And then goes on to elaborate that these are basically just brainwashed murder drones who didn't receive any of that conditioning. Obviously, that gets resolved because the main characters are special and all that, and it is worth noting 2 things. 1, even the characters who didn't receive conditioning are capable of displaying sentience and talking and stuff like that after this happens. It's not just Miyabi, who was never reborn and was just brainwashed, but the brainwashing being undone was a resonance between Off-Seer music and Lucky 7, so it's possible Origin Metal did something with the memories of those characters' past lives in Origin and restored something like that to them. So without the conditioning, they may not have had things like their personality. And second, we can't use these brainwashed murder drone versions of Mwamba, Hacked, and Kamaravi as a comparison to what the conditioning does by just seeing the difference between those, because this was Y doing a different set of experimentation. We have to look a little bit deeper to find out exactly what this stuff means. That being said, the experimentation on these characters meant that they were fighting savagely, more or less using basic instincts, but were powered up by some of the stuff Y did, which is a big comparison point to, we explicitly see that soldiers who pop out of the cradles at their normal first term, instead of being accelerated like these guys were, do need to train and learn how to fight and even how to summon their iris weapon. So we can pretty reasonably guess that something not included in this basic conditioning is anything more than the very basics of combat. Something it does seem like they come out of the cradle with, though, is language. First-termers can talk to each other fine, and likely owing to the fact that this is fiction, seem to be a lot more eloquent than most real 10-year-olds. Since language is something humans developed together and needs to be taught to real children by other people who already know it, it kind of has to be something that's part of the conditioning, because we see people talking fluently at very young terms, and I don't think that they'd be able to learn that much that quickly if they only started learning after coming out of the cradle. It also seems like they have reading and writing downloaded into them as well, because as far as we can tell, training requires a little bit of book learning. Everyone is literate, and it seems like there are reference books in colonies that explain certain things. Plus, they probably had to learn theoretical stuff about tactics and that kind of thing, which is much more effectively learned by being able to write down and annotate diagrams with language and stuff like that. So it does make sense that they have this. And my guess would be that you just take an education that a child in the real world would likely receive up through the age of 10 and just give them all of the stuff from that that would be relevant to life in Ionios. You can take away a lot of that, and there are a few things like critical thinking that Moebius would not want the soldiers to learn, but a lot of that I think just makes sense, and maybe because they're not learning certain things, they do get other things at a more accelerated rate, so that could explain why they're more eloquent than most regular children of that age would be, and maybe they're better at math or something than a 10-year-old who's only received a normal education, simply because they don't need to know about whatever kind of stuff. They have social skills, though. Like, they act like normal children in that regard, so it seems like they're allowed to develop healthy, with air quotes, in the sense of being normal, functional people of their age, and from then on are molded as they continue to grow and develop into soldiers for the system. I'd like to assume that the basic knowledge of the iris is also added during the development procedure, because the people from the original worlds did not have irises in their bodies. That was an Ionios invention, which means that the soldiers grown in cradles have to have them installed each time they're reborn, and that seems to be a cradle process and not something that happens after they come out of it. So, since the Soul in Origin would have no idea how to operate an iris, that's likely also added to them at the time. Now, I know so far we haven't really been talking about actual conditioning. We've more just been talking about knowledge that is or isn't downloaded into their brain. So I think we need to more talk about the psychological side of things, and the first thing we need to bring up here is the fact that conditioning is broken when your iris's connection to a flame clock is severed. This seems to include any possible way this happens, as people becoming Ouroboros, a flame clock being cut, and Noah and Mio's origin off-seer power thing that they do in Mio's side story all seem to be able to do this. As far as we see, Kamaravi is really the only person to completely break through the conditioning on their own. While yes, he does have to destroy his iris eye in order to fully act out, he's doing that so the Moebius can't control him, not because he needs to do that specifically in order to commit to what he wants to do. He's capable of trying to do it, just there are two Moebius who are right there who would be capable of overriding him if he tried. One thing that's almost certainly part of conditioning is the suppression of critical thinking abilities and the ability to make logical connections between things. The party members point out the comparison of child versus adult Armus and Ardans, and realize that now that they're Ouroboros, they're capable of seeing the world in a different light, and are able to make the connection between earlier term soldiers and later term soldiers with other creatures growing up and visibly aging. And keep in mind, even Moebius written literature does explain how things grow to some degree. There are instructions of how to grow crops in Colony 9 that Xeon uses to base his whole farming thing off of. So they're actually exposed to, well, I mean, growing crops is making something reproduce. They're just not able to make the connection between that and how their own life cycle works. I don't think they're fully exposed to the ins and outs and, like, know how sexual reproduction in Armus works in order to potentially raise them or stuff like that, but they are even explicitly taught about things growing and changing. They're just not able to make that connection to themselves. Maybe they're even aware of like how birth works with animals and monsters, but because they come out of cradles, they think that's just a thing animals and monsters do, so they don't realize that that's how they're supposed to work as well. That being said, they also don't question why only humans work differently, and why specifically both Kavesi and Agnians work this way, even though they're supposed to be different, but every other animal-like thing in the world doesn't. So it really seems like one of the big things suppressed is being able to ask questions about the world. I guess a lack of curiosity is a way you could describe it. Although this doesn't prevent specific things like Noah's artistic pursuits and wanting to make music on his own. When it comes to talking about this kind of thing from now on, something that you should probably keep in the back of your mind is the fact that Moebius wants to do this conditioning to mold all of the people into effective soldiers, but also do as little work as possible. The entire thing about Moebius is that they are lazy and hedonistic, so if there's a shortcut in the conditioning to make things work properly, that is probably what they're going to use. Now, yeah, it seems like this conditioning was invented by Y, but he would also most likely want to get it over and done with so he could move on to his next experiment, so even if the motivation for half-assing things is different compared to any other Moebius, he'd probably still effectively do that on the grounds of efficiency. I'm bringing this up because Keves and Agnes have two different writing systems, which means they would have had to program two different things into the Kavesi versus the Agnian cradles. Obviously the spoken language is the same because they can just communicate with each other, but it is two different written languages. Granted, both do just translate directly into the Latin alphabet 1-to-1, so basically every piece of text across the entire series using either of these alphabets is either nonsense, English, or Romanized Japanese, but we don't know if that's actually true in universe. Honestly, the Occam's Razor explanation to this is simply the game was created by Japanese people who already have multiple writing systems in the first place, so Moebius making use of two of them in their downloading language into people's brains is probably a little easier to wrap your head around. But I also think Moebius might have used a shortcut, and that is, as part of the conditioning, instead of just basically developing a set of core memories that's downloaded into everyone, they actually take pre-existing memories and knowledge from that person's original life in Origin, take bits and pieces of it, and heavily suppress that which has to come along for the ride but would be counterproductive to Moebius's goals. So, instead of having to invent two basically files of knowledge on Kavesi alphabet, knowledge on Agnian alphabet, if someone was already literate in the original world, they just take the bit of their memory that corresponded to knowing written and spoken language in that specific script and plugged it back into the version that was born from the cradle while suppressing the context of how they learned it or what they originally used it for. I think this is the case because everyone has differentiated personalities that resemble how they're supposed to be, how they become when they're free of conditioning, and how they are later in life already. We see non-conditioned versions of the Kavesi trio and Yorin in the opening cutscene. We see younger versions of them with conditioning in the flashbacks. We see older versions of them with conditioning in the beginning of the game, and then without conditioning throughout the rest of the game, and they're all clearly the same people. If everyone started with just a completely blank brain and had their basic instincts plus some basic core set of knowledge installed in them, you would think that everyone would start off the same and only differentiate into different personalities later on as they interacted with people and gained new experiences, but they all start out as different people. Like I said, it seems like they did properly develop mentally with whatever was given to them and whatever the conditioning was to make them different people. And I guess, I don't know if there's really any commentary here, but even when they're just feeding people into a war machine, they need them to be different because different people are good at different things, and you can't just work together perfectly with a bunch of versions of yourself or something like that. I'm not sure if that was intentional, but I feel like it would be a shortcut to just take pre-existing pieces of knowledge and copy and paste rather than inventing something from scratch, which I guess is why they have the original Kavessian Agnian scripts from the original worlds, as both of those scripts can be seen in the original Xenoblade 1 and 2, or at least DE for Xenoblade 1, as opposed to there being one unified Ionios script that everyone is given. I feel like another piece that's telling about this is just early on in Chapter 1. It's something that's originally played as a gag, but the more you think about it, the more this kind of all fits together. And that is how it seems like after becoming Ouroboros, the characters just become aware that sexuality is a thing, I guess is the best way to put it. Because pre-Ouroboros, Colony 9 has completely unisex baths, and no one bats an eye at that. That's completely normalized. But then, after becoming Ouroboros, all of the guys all of a sudden know, oh wait, it's not okay to change in front of the girls. They're conscious about that and seem to understand something like that. So why is a social cue like that even in their brain in the first place if there's no reason for Moebius to put it there, unless some of their basic social skills and knowledge of that kind of thing was copy-pasted from how they would have learned it in the original world, where it would make perfect sense for them to have learned that being a thing, but with anything related to sexuality suppressed, because that is very obviously another thing the conditioning does. Not only are they not taught about sex, they also just lack any of the instincts about it. Keves and Agnes are countries made up entirely of people going through puberty, and the only time we know soldiers have ever had children is ones that made it to the city, and as such would have probably had their flame clock destroyed and been freed from the conditioning. Obviously, that happening isn't a guarantee, and they could have easily figured out ways to accomplish things or have done them in groups of people in a way that would ensure no one would get pregnant. Can you tell I am trying to not get demonetized while talking about this subject? But again, it's the same thing with how there's no way that in the entire history of Ionios, no soldier stumbled upon a monster or animal just out there in the world giving birth. Either none of them tried anything, or enough of them tried where statistically, at least someone had to have gotten pregnant at some point. And since it seems like that part didn't happen, it's most likely that conditioning just shuts off any potential urges or curiosity about that kind of thing. And you know Moebius must have had absolute confidence in the conditioning as well, because soldiers can still have kids if it's broken. They didn't think or didn't bother, like, sterilizing them in any way in the cradles, which seems like something that's not out of the purview of what people as evil as Moebius would do. So they must have made certain that the conditioning would completely prevent anyone from trying that in the first place. Like, even if they got in like a cringy hentai setup position out of pure coincidence, there would still be a mental block preventing anything specific happening, I guess. We're gonna just move on because I would like to get money from this video. Keep in mind, when I said all that, I'm explicitly referring to only sexual attraction or desire to have sex in general. This doesn't really specifically mean that the concept of having feelings for someone is entirely erased. It's just more so that none of them would have a sex drive, which would obviously cut off a big chunk of ways to be attracted to someone, and they also just don't have the context or knowledge of being romantically into someone, or the idea of that kind of relationship in the first place. Because, just use Noah and Mio as an example. They only got to know each other after they became Ouroboros and lost all of this conditioning, and they still didn't realize they were into each other until they were taught what a romantic relationship is. And we obviously know, we could pretty reasonably assume that they would be attracted to each other outside the confines of Ionios, seeing as how they get together in every single lifetime and aren't completely opposed to the idea of having sex because Gondor exists. Basically, there's absolutely nothing wrong with interpreting any relationship between any of the soldiers in Ionios as romantic. The characters themselves might just not realize that's the case until after they lose their connection to their flame clock. Yeah, I think I kind of inadvertently made specifically the Fiona and Irma ship a lot more tragic with this one, so I am sorry for that. Honestly though, the fact that they're even capable of being romantically attracted to each other is another indication that the conditioning is just picking and choosing bits and pieces of a person's original memories, because why would they even upload the ability for that to happen in the first place? Really, if you think about it, why is there gender in Keves and Agnes? Doesn't really seem necessary to what Moebius is using the soldiers for. And really, among people that are still under the conditioning, it is completely vestigial. So arguably the only reason it's there in the first place is because Moebius is made up of people from the old world, so into the new one they just brought all the things they know and are used to. So, like, gender existing in largely the same way it did in the past, despite the traditional roles it played in society largely being completely obliterated purely because the old, out-of-touch, literal embodiments of the status quo can't think of any other potentially better ways it could be. I think I will play Xenoblade 3 today. What's this doing here? Like, this whole conditioning thing could have been designing from scratch a tailor-made personality for the perfect soldier, and wiping the brains of every single person raised from a cradle and installing that in all of them. But instead, people keep their original personalities to some degree. They just have parts of it tweaked or removed, and some of that can even be restored with either time or having the conditioning undone. So it's like, either intentionally or not, all of the soldiers retain their original personality, but even if they're suppressed, because things like orientation or how someone would treat someone they're in a relationship with are also intrinsically part of someone, that does come along for the ride, though it's suppressed, and when the conditioning is removed, they just become a more enlightened, actualized version of themselves. A big bit of Moebius is how they are their own undoing in basically all things, so while yeah, they could have completely wiped the memory of everyone and designed a package of whatever knowledge they wanted people to have and installed that exact same thing in every single person, and arguably that's what Y was trying to work on and was stopped before that could happen, they instead chose to do this half measure and take bits and pieces of the person's original knowledge and memories and use that to base their conditioning and personality off of, and that more or less leads to their own downfall in the end, because letting them retain their abilities of critical thinking and questioning the world and only locking that behind their connection to the flame clock, when you've got origin avatars who go on to found the Liberators and are more than capable of beating Moebius and cutting flame clocks on their own, pretty much ensures that that system is going to fall eventually. Now, one thing I did say in the original video is that maybe the conditioning renders the soldiers more susceptible to propaganda, and I kind of completely disagree with that now. And that's, again, partially because it's very in character for Moebius to have done the bare minimum with this kind of thing. It would make sense for basic conditioning for a soldier of Keves or Agnes to include either something to make them more obedient by default, or more susceptible to propaganda, or both, or something along those lines to allow them to be more easily controlled. However, it's unnecessary, at least from Moebius's point of view. Despite everything I said, all of the soldiers are still young people who are brought up in the military hierarchy, and there already is discussion in-game of the conditioning stopping them from understanding how the world works or questioning certain things. Like, unless the Liberators or Lost Numbers directly walk into your colony or battlefield, you're just a kid being exposed to propaganda, and the only adults in your lives are the authority figures responsible for creating said propaganda. You don't need to be conditioned to be more affected by it. That's just your life. And because Moebius literally always considers their enemies irrelevant until it's too late, while the Liberators or Lost Numbers waltzing up and freeing you from the flame clock and letting you understand this kind of thing is a distinct possibility, Moebius doesn't think so. So doing anything to counteract that would be completely redundant to them. And because they like doing the bare minimum and just want to maintain the status quo, they're not going to include redundancies in anything they do. So basically the main takeaway from this video is include redundant systems and additional ways of solving your problems whenever you do something, or you become Moebius. I don't really know where that one was going. But the discussion of the conditioning in the original Husk video was maybe 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes long. You can look at the length of this video and see that it is much longer than that. Obviously, I did cut out a lot of things I wanted to talk about just because it was always a smaller part of a bigger video, but I hope you can understand why I split it up into 2 this time. Genuinely, I don't think the final exclusively Husk video is going to be this long because I realized while making this one that I had more to talk about, but it's going to be worth it to have split them, I think, in the long run. So thank you for watching. Look forward to that one next, and look forward to the Riku video finally after that one. Until then, this is Luxon, signing off.